Finance. The committee is proceeding to the consideration of matters related to committee business. More specifically, the motion of PS Rachel Bendayan and the amendment of MP Lawrence. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the Standing Order 15.1. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Although this room is equipped with a powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to the microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. In order to prevent incidents and safeguard the hearing health of the interpreters, I invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on the table away from the microphone when they are not in use. Reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. So on that, we last left where MP Couric had the floor and was speaking on the to the amendment, and then we had in speaking order MP Blakey, MP Genius, MP Lawrence, MP Majumdar, and MP Soroka. So, MP Couric.
Please be added to the speaking list, Chair.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Chair. And of course, it's good to be back before the Finance Committee and to talk about an issue that is so important to many of my constituents, many Albertans, and of course many Canadians. And specifically, I'm glad to have the chance to continue to talk about how this amendment in particular and some of the foundations surrounding why the motion that Ms. Bendian brought forward is continuing a trend that endeavors to divide this country for the narrow political interests of a prime minister that seems to care about nothing more than his electoral success, and has built a political infrastructure, built a political movement around almost a cult of his personality that is bent on dividing our country. So, Mr. Chair, if you recall, when I had the opportunity to speak to Mr. Lawrence's very common sense amendment, where the intent is very clear. We are endeavoring to take out the politics of the motion to bring a resemblance of something that is, I believe, what should be the responsibility of so many Canadians. But Chair, if I could, I left off talking about my late grandfather Couric, who and it seemed to offend the Liberal members of this committee that I would dare talk about a member of my family who was the son of Polish immigrants and left in the late 30s a difficult situation in Poland, and we're seeking opportunity. We're seeking what we would say now, what many would define as a Canadian dream. And my late grandfather Couric, I talked a little bit about his involvement in the oil and gas industry, specifically the construction of the Gooseberry Lake gas plant. And at some point, maybe probably not before the Finance Committee, although we'll see what circumstances lead to. I'd be happy to talk at length about the value of Canada's energy industry, and it has actually a very direct correlation with the livelihoods of Canadians and pensions, and especially a very big connection about the division perpetrated upon our country by Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister and his Liberals. But Chair specifically, the reason why I brought up that story, and it's puzzling to me that it would offend the Liberals to talk about what I shared a little bit, very, very briefly and succinctly, because of course Canada and the diversity of our history is immense. But when I started talking about the story of my late grandfather, the Liberals became almost unhinged in their offense taken.
Mr. Chair,
But Chair, I would...
Point of order. What the heck does this have to do with the motion? Like, honestly.
That's not a point of order,
my parents came from another
debate.
country
That's
as
not a
well.
point of order.
What does it have to do with the motion?
And I would ask that we be respectful of each
Relevance,
other.
please. Relevance, Mr.
Yes,
Chair.
relevance, yes. Yeah, MP
I don't want to
Couric,
hear your
please,
story, Mr. Couric. But let's talk
Couric,
to the motion,
yes,
please.
MP Zerowitz, please, no crosstalk over that. So, yes, MP Couric, please, relevance to and sticking to the motion and the amendment that has been proposed to the motion.
Absolutely, Chair. And again, it's something. It's almost predictable that the Liberals would be so offended by how the story of our country is that has been stitched together by stories like mine, and I'm sure that Liberal members, and I know my colleagues here, and have various stories that make up what is the Canadian story. I'm very proud of that, and I find it's unbelievable that would be so offensive to Liberal members, and specifically as it
Chair,
relates directly to this motion. It is
relevance, please, Mr. Chair.
It is.
Is it a point of order?
It is point of order.
Point of order?
It's
Relevance.
She's had a point of order, relevance, yes. Again,
so-
MP Couric, if you can please
focus
on the amendment to the motion.
Absolutely, Chair.
Yeah.
And once again,
Mr. Chair, point of order.
I find
Point of
Chair,
order.
Point of chair.
Point of order.
If
There's
the member
a point
does-
of order, go ahead.
If the member doesn't have a copy of the motion at hand, do you think we can give that to him?
So I do have a copy
Through
of it,
you,
Chair. Thank
Mr. Chair, could you ask the member whether or not he has a copy of the motion?
Point of order.
Chair.
That's not a point of order.
Point of order.
This is, Chair, all due respect, your role as chair is to mitigate the interruptions with unfounded point of orders. And what I've witnessed here at committee, I'm surprised. As much as I'm subbing in today.
Thank you, MP Tokar. What the point of order was on relevance, and that is an allowable point of order. So we are going back to relevance, MP Couric, on relevance. To
Point of order,
the
Chair, look.
Point of order, MP Helen.
And a point of order for relevance can be brought up. The issue is that you have to make that decision whether he's preambling to get back to that motion or not. And in my opinion, this is what he's doing. He's laying out the pain that Canadians are feeling.
Thank you, MP Helen.
And you have to consider that
MP Helen.
when you're making your decision.
We are going back to MP Couric. I'm asking you to be relevant to the amendment to the motion. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. And as I've been so rudely interrupted now a couple of times, making that very, very clear connection that exists between the amendment that we are discussing and the larger conversation around Ms. Bendayan's motion that is so specifically designed to not bring our country together, but rather to divide Canadians against one another, to divide, in this case, Albertans against the rest of the country, divide in every way possible. So, and I do find it really, really funny, and maybe this is because Justin Trudeau believes that Canada is a post-national state, that they don't believe in the idea of Canada. But I find it really, really concerning, Chair, that you would have members of the Liberal Party that would be so offended by the fact that my story, as it would be the case, I I would expect, with every person around this table, every member of Parliament, and the unique journey that they take to be a part of Canada's House of Commons, that it speaks to what we are as Canadians. And now the members opposite, and why this is so directly relevant to the issue at hand, is members opposite are making this a concern for our country, which is a fair comment to make. So the fact that they would deny the stories of Canadians to be a part of this conversation truly is an astounding revelation to the attitude that the Liberals approach are the governing of our country. So, Chair, whether it's my family and my late grandfather Currick that I had spoken very, very briefly about, or whether it be other members, and I know quite well my Conservative team members here, which have all of them incredible stories that lend towards the idea that has built Canada, and specifically the infrastructure associated with that. So, Chair, when we are talking about the divisions being brought to our country by a government that is so bent on ensuring that they would push forward on policies like the carbon tax, that have a direct impact on the livelihoods of Canadians. Now, Chair, I would venture back, if I could, to 2015. When the conversation surrounding the carbon tax, and Chair, it directly relates to this motion here because it's the consequences of the policies of this Liberal government that and their attitude towards how they govern this country that has led to an untenable situation. So in 2015, the conversation around the carbon tax, the then leader of the Liberal Party and now Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, time and time again, when asked about some of the intricacies about how the carbon tax would be applied, Chair, the Prime Minister made it clear throughout the course of that campaign, for example, that he would not impose his will, the federal government's will, on Canadians, and that he would not be overstepping his bounds as Prime Minister. Yet we saw how even in the early days of the Liberals' mandate post-2015, we saw that provincial governments no longer mattered. We saw that the Liberals would do anything and everything they could to trample upon provinces, to trample upon any person, any group, any jurisdiction that did not fulfill their political objective. And we see that very, very clearly with the carbon tax. And Chair, if I could take you back to one of the first meetings that then Environment Minister Catherine McKenna had with her provincial counterparts. The press release, the invitation to that meeting was very clearly said to be one of wanting to come together and discuss climate action and action on the environment. However, Mr. Chair, what was interesting, it was actually Scott Moe, who was Environment Minister in the province of Saskatchewan at the time, attended that meeting. And when he walked into that meeting, he found something, not a collaborative environment, not a minister who was willing to listen, not a government that was looking out for the best interests of the country and willing to collaborate with its jurisdictional partners. And for the sake of brevity, Chair, I won't go into, and although there are different members here than were here on Monday night, I talked a little bit about some of our history. It is so relevant to dive back into the history of what led to the formation of how Canada is meant to operate as a country. But when now Premier Scott Moe, who was then the Saskatchewan Environment Minister, walked into this meeting, he learned quickly that it was not meant to be one of collaboration. It was not meant to be one of discussion. He walked into this meeting and found that the Liberal minister, led by this Prime Minister and the activists that seem to control the Prime Minister's office, they were handed instructions as to what they would and would not accept. And Mr. Chair, at the time, and it made quite a bit of news actually at the time, we had the then Environment Minister of the province of Saskatchewan, Scott Moe, actually walk out of the meeting. And when asked by the media, he ironically said something that echoes throughout our history by saying, "Just watch me." And he walked out because it was quite a moment, and it spoke to it's true. He maybe had a little bit less gray hair back then, Chair, but it's some of us are losing it quicker than others, I guess. But Chair, what was interesting is that as the then Environment Minister, and there was an effort, and I know former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall quite well. There was a willingness to develop those relationships to work together for the good of our country, although they might have disagreed on the politics. And I can assure you, Brad Wall and Justin Trudeau do not agree on very much when it comes to politics. But there was a willingness and an understanding that Justin Trudeau, having just won the election, that there was that need to work together. However, that only went one direction. And Chair, what is so disgusting, quite frankly, is that we have seen an erosion of national unity that has taken place over the last 8 or so years that Justin Trudeau has been Prime Minister. An erosion of national unity, Chair, because you have seen continually how this Prime Minister cares not about our nation's unity, cares not about ensuring a prosperous Canada for all, but rather he's quick to hold some back so that he can pick winners and losers. And the result, Mr. Chair, is a divided country. And the reason why I talk about the carbon tax, and specifically the way that the then leader of the Liberal Party, third party at the time, talked about the carbon tax, is he promised that it would be a collaborative process. Yet we saw the moment he was elected that was nothing more than talk. And if I could give credit to the Liberals for one thing, and I apologize to my Conservative members, is that they are good at politics. They're good at politics. They are good at the rhetoric. They are good at the saying the right things at the right time, the strategy associated with this. But Chair, the ultimate reason why that is not a compliment is because they're so good at politics for the purposes of attaining power that they are leaving our country divided and weaker as a result. So to my friends across the table here in the Liberal Party, being good at politics is not enough to be good at governing the country. You have to be willing to work together, and we have seen time and time again that they are simply incapable of doing that. So Chair, the carbon tax is a good example. We had a number of provincial governments throughout the last 8 years that had elected provincial governments specifically and that oppose the carbon tax, that oppose it. And you would think that would be a valid question about that a provincial government could run on, especially when it comes to, and I read the Supreme Court ruling on that, and if I could sum it up in the fact of
Suspenders, bells are ringing. So as we usually do, we do ask if we could continue straight through till close to the vote, if we have unanimous consent.
Do you want to deny?
No?
No, that's easy.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe get this done. Come back after the vote.
Yeah, we would. We need UC to continue and then just do the vote and then come back after the vote. Yes, but yeah, okay.
No UC.
Okay. I heard no UC for that. Okay, there's no UC.
Look forward to continuing after.
Okay, so we're suspended till after the vote.
It's not good to keep it.
Why do we want to just dribble for 25 minutes?
I'm just about to get
Okay, well, we're back. We've all voted, everybody. Hope you voted the right way, and we've got and more good news here. More good news. We've got our hardworking clerk Alexandre Roger's birthday is this week. Yeah, we got it. Okay. So yes, happy birthday, Alexandre, and
She made you something.
Wow. Okay, so we will. We're and we have to let's another opportunity for us to thank all those that travel to the east and the west and the many cities for the PBC. We've got to thank Alexandre and his team and everybody that coordinated that, all the logistics and that made that happen. So thank you. And now we're back with MP Kirk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And of course, it is good to be able to continue this conversation. And just to, I was a little bit surprised actually that the Liberals denied consent to allow this meeting to continue, because I was happy to continue talking about the divisions that Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has inflicted upon our country. And Chair, let me just highlight a couple examples of this. And to the very, very human level, is that when I speak with constituents, an increasingly common sentiment that I hear, and this is tragic, an increasingly common sentiment that I hear is that my constituents feel that Canada is broken. And in many cases, Chair, they will share things with me like they're simply not sure about whether our country has a future. In fact, there's some that feel like there's no option but to see that the consequences of disunity could be absolutely devastating to the future of our country. And Chair, the reason why that's so tragic is that it could have been avoided and should be the priority of any leader, of any member of a governing party. Their first priority in government should be one of national unity. Yet, Chair, we have seen over the last 8 years an intentionality put towards dividing Canadians for narrow political gain. And in fact, we saw that just this past week, how the Liberals intentionally included in a free trade agreement with Ukraine. They intentionally included a carbon tax mechanism into that. And it's shameful that they would be so intent on division that they would, even a country at war, to inflict that sort of, to play that sort of politics there is absolutely shameful. We see, Chair, I have the court ruling here, on the Impact Assessment Act. How we see that it was found to be largely unconstitutional. Bill C-69. Now, this should be no surprise to anybody who has listened to commentary on this subject over the last 6 or so years since this was introduced. Every province, in fact, the only thing we see provinces united in these days, it seems, is in that they're united against the actions of Justin Trudeau, and that's certainly not a record that one should be proud of. I talked about the carbon tax. It has intentionally divided Canadians, and including, I mentioned the Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. Well, it was Conservatives that initially negotiated back in 2013. In fact, it was Stephen Harper who looked Vladimir Putin in the face and told him to get out of Ukraine. That's leadership, not like what we have seen by this division perpetrated by a prime minister, by Prime Minister Trudeau. We've seen that the carbon tax in this recent carve-out that benefits 3% of Canadians, yet continues to punish the other 97% of Canadians, including those who are struggling to pay their bills, heating with propane, natural gas, and other forms that are still subject to that. We see that intentionality to divide. Chair, we see with conversations around equalization, where there should be the willingness to have real conversations with provinces. We have not seen that under Justin Trudeau. He may talk big about photo ops, but then when it comes to what happens behind closed doors, it's division and it's pitting region against region. We see that with the continued conversation around the emissions cap. Chair, I could only imagine that if the Prime Minister was to pick any other part of the country and tell them that they cannot do what they're good at. Could you imagine? Any other sector, any other, whether it be manufacturing, whatever the case is, pick a part of the country, and if the federal government was to swoop in and say, you can't do what you're good at. Mr. Chair, it is absolutely shameful, the division that is being perpetrated on this country by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his Liberals. We see that with the KXL. You have, and this is the tragic irony, Chair, especially with the KXL pipeline, of which the Alberta portion of that pipeline is in my constituency, and I saw about 2,000 jobs lost because our Liberal Prime Minister refused to work with his American counterpart because they were so blinded by ideology around the future of energy security in North America that they canceled a pipeline at a time when we were saying, conservatives were vocally saying the entire time, that energy security would be key to our world's security future. Yet we see that the Liberals capitulated. We see that with the just transition, Chair. It's policy that is designed to divide Canadians for narrow political gain. We see this with LNG. Chair, again, there was, I think, 18 projects on the books when Justin Trudeau took office. Never before in Canadian history whether it be Canada's fiscal situation, whether it be with the economic opportunity, Justin Trudeau was handed a circumstance that any world leader would be jealous of, yet he squandered it away for narrow political gain. And Chair, the reason why this is so applicable to the conversation that we are having today around this amendment and the motion is because the Liberals throughout the last 8 years have led our country to a point where it is Canadians have been pitted against one another, where there is division layered upon division, and the result is that we have seen less prosperity. The result is we have seen political divisions that are incredibly harmful. In fact, just this past week, you had Liberals that were almost incoherent because Canadians would dare question that they were concerned about that activist environment minister, the same environment minister who was criminally charged for environmental activism, that he would call and try to influence so-called independent senators, although it certainly showed their hand in the last week, that the Canadians would show concern about that members of that Liberal Party were so outraged that Canadians would dare share an opinion that contradicted their official narrative. It is truly unbelievable and shameful. So, Chair, many of my constituents, as I shared at the last meeting, remember Pierre Elliott Trudeau and the divisions perpetrated upon our country. And in fact, I still hear often, although Rick would probably remember some of those days. I wasn't I wasn't born yet, but I hear a common sentiment, Chair, that many are not surprised that the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau would continue along that path where he, what is known as the Trudeau salute, he would continue to divide this country for political gain. Chair, it is unbelievable, it is unacceptable, and Canadians deserve better. So, Chair, I hope that this committee, I hope that Liberal, NDP, and Bloc members will take seriously this common sense amendment to try and take some of the language of division, the politics of division out of this motion that is brought forward for no other reason than to continue perpetrating that division upon Canadians, East versus West, North versus South, urban versus rural, and in this case, the rest of the country against Alberta. So, Chair, I look forward to continuing the discussion on this. I hope that this committee will see that better is possible, that we can bring home a country that is once again unified. However, the history of the last 8 years certainly does not give me and my constituents optimism in that regard, which is why we so desperately need a change. We need a government that is willing to put the unity of our country ahead of their personal, partisan, political, and as we increasingly see with the number of scandals that seem to be making liberal insiders rich, their personal financial interests first. So thank you very much, Chair, for this opportunity. Certainly, I'd be happy to expand further on the connection between this amendment and the history that has led to the point that we were at today, and I certainly will do so. So, Chair, I would, as I cede my time to the next person on the list, I would ask to be put back on the list so that we can continue this conversation. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, MP Couric. I have got MP Blakey, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm certainly glad to have the opportunity to weigh in on the question of the Canada Pension Plan. And I think I'll start by talking a little bit about the plan, because we've heard there's been a lot of discussion around the table so far, particularly by Conservative members, but there hasn't actually been a lot of talk about the Canada Pension Plan. And I think that the Canada Pension Plan has been an excellent thing for Canadians. And the only deficiency, as far as I'm concerned, in the plan is that we're not paying enough into it to get a larger benefit out of it. When the Canada Pension Plan was designed, it was meant to only be a third of Canadians' retirement income, and it has been an incredible success in terms of what it was designed to be, which is just a third of what people would need to get by in retirement. The other third was to be a company pension, and the final third was to come from Canadians' own personal savings and investments. Now, we live in a Canada today where over 70% of people working at a job don't have a company pension plan of any kind, whether a defined contribution plan or a defined benefit plan. So right there, when we're talking about the Canada Pension Plan and what it was designed to be, working in concert with a company pension and personal savings, we know that the Canada Pension Plan won't get people through their retirement because they don't have that other leg of the three-legged stool that was supposed to be the foundation of Canadians' retirement income. So I think that's a problem. I think employers should be exhorted and pushed to bring back company pensions, or we need to recognize that the CPP now is meant to replace 2/3 at least of Canadians' retirement income, or to provide 2/3 of that income. And we don't have a Canada Pension Plan that is built to provide 2/3 of Canadians' retirement income. So I would say that the CPP was designed for a system that no longer obtains, and we either need to considerably expand the Canada Pension Plan or develop a strategy for pushing more employers to offer their own pension plans to employees. And when we look at the third stool, and we look at the affordability crisis that we're facing today, but also, frankly, from the early 1990s on, real wages have not kept pace with the pace of inflation. Even when inflation was at target, wages did not grow as quickly as the price that people were paying for housing, because for as much as the housing crisis has accelerated over the past 2 or 3 years, it's a 30-year trajectory that has led us to where we are, and it's on an exponential curve. So for those at home who aren't familiar with exponential curves, the further you go on the curve, the more quickly things rise. And so as we continue on this exponential crisis curve, it's not a surprise to see that prices are increasing more and more every year. Canada still isn't addressing some of the fundamental causes of the housing crisis. But what that means for Canadians' personal savings and their ability to buy RRSPs or to invest or to just sock away cash is that diminishes as the cost of groceries and food and prescription drugs and everything else goes up. So that means that the third leg of that stool also is in bad shape. The good thing about the CPP is that because it's taken off The premiums are taken from employers and they're taken off the check of Canadian workers before that money enters in their account. Canadians aren't forced to bid that money to increase the price of a home to get it over either the other Canadians or the investors that they're competing against in order to get a home. So the CPP has not, is the money that people make as part of their wage package has not contributed to inflation in housing because it's already getting socked away in a pension plan and it's not available to bid on the cost of a home. And I think that's also been a great benefit to Canadians, and it's helped ensure that at least the only solid leg of the retirement savings three-legged stool that's supposed to get Canadians through retirement that's in any kind of good shape is the Canada Pension Plan, and it is in very good shape. We've got a number, you know, they're required to have regular actuarial reports that pronounce on the state of the Canada Pension Plan. That plan is in good shape for the next 75 years plus. So, and it's seen over the last 10 years, I think the average return has been 10%. I think many Canadians who have had private investments through mutual funds and other things like that would have been very happy over the last 10 years to see a 10% return. That's partly because of the size of the Canada Pension Plan. It means that it can play an investment space that smaller mutual funds can't. And it's also able to spread the risk over, you know, all of the Canadians that work in the labor market, which is millions of them. I don't have the exact number, but if you think of the 40 million Canadians that there are in Canada, most of them are going to participate in the workforce at some time in their life, and they're going to pay into the CPP. That means spreading the risk across everyone in Canada, whereas normally, if you invest in a fund, you don't have that big a fund. And this is going to be relevant, too, when we talk about Alberta deciding to have its own pension plan, if indeed that's where the Conservative government in Alberta wants to go. So, you know, so the CPP offers, it's the only part of the Canadian retirement savings edifice that's in good shape. It does that in part by sharing risk over a larger group of people. And I think if you asked anyone, would you like to be in a pension plan with 10,000 members? Would you like to be in a pension plan with 100,000 members? Would you like to be in a pension plan with 1 million members or 40 million members? Most Canadians are going to say, I'd rather be in the plan with 40 million members because, wow, is that ever going to allow me to spread the risk across a lot more people? And it's going to allow my pension fund to make investments that are more likely to get return and to spread risk across the portfolio. So that's one of the great benefits. But another great benefit of the Canada Pension Plan, because it applies to all workers and because it applies to workers no matter where they live in the country and no matter where they work in the country, with the exception of Quebec, of course, which has its own plan, it's fully portable. Now, that has been an advantage to Canadian workers who have had to go to other provinces in order to secure work, but ultimately want to retire in their home province. It has also been an incredible advantage to employers who have wanted to secure labor from other parts of the country when their own province hasn't been able to meet the labor need, because it's meant that people don't have to compromise on their pension in order to go work in another part of the country. So I think the portability of the CPP, as well as its ability to spread risk, are two very important advantages. And the other advantage that I'm going to highlight today is that the Canada Pension Plan, I talked earlier about how over 70% of Canadians working today don't have any pension plan at all. But for those who do, often, and more as time goes on, they're defined contribution plans. What that means is that the whole risk of the pension lies on the worker. If the investments don't turn out, that means a reduced benefit for the worker. Whereas in a defined benefit plan, the workers are guaranteed a certain benefit that they can bank on, that they can budget with. Now, we know when it comes to the CPP that defined benefit has not been growing quickly enough to make up for rising costs. And Canadians who are depending only on their CPP, again, a larger and larger share of workers that will be true for as they retire and they haven't had a company pension and they've struggled to be able to put money away while they're trying to pay the rent and the groceries. But their CPP amount will be the same amount. And even though it doesn't grow fast enough, it will grow by predictable measures. And that is an incredible benefit to Canadians, and another reason why, in my view, we should be talking about expanding the Canada Pension Plan And I think it's really unfortunate that the major debate we're having about the Canada Pension Plan right now is about shrinking it by having the province of Alberta exit. And I disagree strongly with Premier Smith in Alberta, who has been driving this. I think there's a lot of public opinion polling to show actually this isn't something Albertans are calling for. This is something that the government is trying to create a desire for in the province of Alberta. And I don't believe that that will be good for Albertans, and I don't believe that it will be good for Canadians in the rest of the country, because the CPP is an excellent plan for all the reasons that I've just mentioned. So, you know, so what are the problems with Danielle Smith's plan, or what she's proposing? Well, there's a LifeWorks report that the Alberta government commissioned a couple years ago, but didn't release until after the election, presumably because they knew what we know, which is that the overwhelming majority of Albertans aren't interested in leaving the Canada Pension Plan. And for good reason. Apparently they understand something that Danielle Smith does not. And so they hired LifeWorks. We know LifeWorks by another name. LifeWorks reinvented itself. It used to be Morneau Chappelle. In other words, Danielle Smith hired some random liberal to run the numbers for her. And it's kind of odd to see conservatives who usually really get in a tizzy anytime you quote a liberal source, unless it happens to agree with the position they've already taken. And it would be very interesting to go back and see all of the things that conservatives have had to say about Morneau Chappelle, particularly those who would seek to defend Danielle Smith.
Point of order,
don't kid
Mr.
yourself,
Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Mr.
What's
Chair.
going on here?
I'm just following the lead of my colleague Julie. I just want to know, is there any relevance to what Mr. Blakey is saying to the topic?
I think there's one.
Be relevant,
right on top.
be relevant to the motion and the amendment, please.
Well, sure, but I'm talking about the report that Danielle Smith commissioned about the CPP. I'm right on topic. I would love for any Canadian listening today to lay out Mr. Kirk's remarks at committee in Hansard beside mine and see who's more relevant to the topic at hand. So I thank Mr. Halan for his intervention, but I hope he will take my reassurances to heart that I am indeed very relevant. But it was an interesting point for him to intervene because he actually helped make my point. My point is that Canadians here shouldn't kid themselves. What's going on by the Conservative Party at this table is nothing but a defense of Danielle Smith. Because they've said that apparently, the federal Conservatives support Alberta staying in the plan. They say the only thing they find objectionable in the motion is the mention of Danielle Smith. So what's going on here? Well, if it's not on the substance of the issue, then it must be on the politics of the issue, and they've identified that for us by saying that they would gladly pass this motion if it didn't mention Danielle Smith. So what's happening here is a defense of Danielle Smith, and perhaps they're taking their cues from Preston Manning, who recently, in an email, encouraged federal Conservatives to have a closer practical relationship. I'm quoting now from a news article. Manning encouraged a closer practical relationship between Premier Danielle Smith's United Conservatives and the federal Conservatives to promote shared interests, adding everybody benefits, especially Alberta. So now, surprise, surprise, the email gets sent out by one of the kind of pillars of the Canadian Conservative movement. I think it's fair to call Preston Manning that. And what we see here are Conservatives saying, we agree with the substance of the issue, but we just don't think anyone should be allowed to criticize Danielle Smith. And we're going to tie up the whole Finance Committee, which is studying the housing crisis. We're going to put an end to that study, effectively, in order to run political defense for Danielle Smith. So I think that was pretty interesting. And so as I was saying, Danielle Smith hired a former Liberal finance minister's company, Morneau Chappelle, to run the numbers for her, came up with quite an impressive number, which, you know, is a testament to what consultants are prepared to do for the right fee. We know a lot about that in Ottawa. The Liberals love to hire consultants. This was a Conservative government hiring a Liberal consultant to get a number that they wanted that says Alberta would be entitled to over 50% of what's currently in the Canada pension plan. Now, there are a lot of other people who aren't random liberals who have said actually Alberta's entitlement would be a lot less. We'll leave it to Conservatives to decide whether they want to take the advice of a paid random liberal or whether they want to take the advice of the CPPIB, for instance, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, or some of the other economists that have come out to say that, in fact, Alberta wouldn't be entitled to 55 or 60% of what's in the Canada Pension Plan Fund, but would probably be entitled to somewhere between 12 and 18%, which is a considerable difference. It's considerable in terms of percentages, but when you think that we're dealing in hundreds of billions of dollars, the absolute difference becomes quite impressive indeed. And so, as I say, hired a random liberal, got a number that they wanted. It's reminiscent of the Brexit campaign. You may recall Boris Johnson, a Conservative, came up with a number, 350 million pounds a day, he said, could be reinvested in the National Health Service in Britain. People in the UK would get the best health service ever. The best health now, ooh, doesn't that start to sound like somebody else? Donald Trump. I'll come back to him in a minute. But, you know, best health care ever, 350 million pounds a day, just vote for Brexit. Well, people in the UK did. It would be interesting to ask them how they feel about their health care. I read an article recently that says health care is really not much better at all since Brexit. But we, even as Canadian parliamentarians, have spent a lot of time talking about the consequences of Brexit. It's had a terrible economic impact on the United Kingdom, and it's had a terrible political impact. If we think about the conflict between Ireland and Northern Ireland and what it's done on the border, the potential for violence that has started up again, and all of that was predicated in part on a lie about what it would mean for the United Kingdom's economic performance if they did what the Conservatives there encouraged them to do, a lie about what it would mean for their health care if they were to go in that direction. And the other thing that the National Health Service Brexit debate has in common with the CPP is that the decision is irrevocable. There is no path back for the United Kingdom into the European Union, just as there will be no path back for Alberta into the Canada Pension Plan if this decision is made. And I find it very reassuring to know that the majority of Albertans aren't interested in that, because it would do damage not only to Alberta workers, but workers across the country, except in Quebec, of course, because it would have a significant impact on their pension. So why is this plan dangerous? Well, it's dangerous because of the impact that it would have. But it doesn't, Alberta doesn't have to decide to leave the Canada Pension Plan in order for it to be dangerous now. What's being talked about is a potential referendum in 2025. So people say, okay, well, that's a ways away. And even if Alberta did decide to leave, it would be another 2 or 3 years before they were out of the plan. So now we're into 27, 28. Well, maybe this isn't such a bad thing, and we should let the process roll out. Hence, Conservative voices here saying, don't criticize Danielle Smith, just let her go out and consult. But folks that have talked to the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, who know a little bit about investing, would know that when you're managing a $580 billion portfolio that also includes a lot of hard assets, investment decisions have to be made years in advance in order to have enough liquidity to pay out someone who's demanding, whether it's 12, whether it's 18, or whether it's 50% of your holdings. You need to start arranging your investments in such a way as to be able to pay that out. Those investment decisions are not 4 or 5 years away. Those investment decisions are coming soon. And that's why what Danielle Smith is doing in Alberta is not innocent, and it's not harmless. It is dangerous, and it's dangerous now. Because for the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board to take the government of Alberta seriously means to start lining up its investment decisions now. This organization that has been successful in delivering a 10% return over the last 10 years for Canadians through very difficult economic times has to contemplate changing its investment behavior in the near future in order to have enough liquid assets to pay out Alberta if Alberta decides to leave, and if that happens on a 2027, 2028, 2029 timeline. It's coming. It's coming, and they have to be ready for that. So it is a dangerous plan. And as I said, I think it's predicated on some bad numbers by some random liberal, but it's also important to note that the idea that somehow Alberta is paying more into the CPP than it's getting out assumes that because people happen to be working at Alberta, and I would add, at Alberta's invitation from other parts of the country, means that yes, it was paid in Alberta, but I don't think there's anything wrong with people retiring to their home province and collecting their pension there. I mean, effectively what Danielle Smith is saying is she wants to control where people take their retirement, and if they worked in Alberta, they should retire in Alberta, because that's the only way to have fairness. I think people should have the financial freedom within Canada to retire wherever they like. And if they did the work, they received those payments into the CPP. Alberta never received those payments. Those workers received those payments, yes, from an Alberta employer, but an Alberta employer who recruited them and hired them and asked them to stay and to work for them in that province. And it's up to Canadian workers to decide where they take their retirement and where that money goes in their retirement. I would add also that there's a liability that the provinces where they retire are assuming, which is their healthcare liability, among others. And so the provinces where those folks have retired, who are now living on a much lower income, paying their taxes with a lower income in their home province, need to access healthcare services there. And so to say that it's just unfair because when they were paid, when their employer paid what the worker earned on their labor into the Canada Pension Plan, they were working in Alberta, and now they've retired to New Brunswick, somehow that's unfair to Alberta, I think is to misunderstand the nature of those contributions. Those are contributions for the worker. They're not contributions for any one province. And Alberta wouldn't have been able to generate that wealth without having people come to do the work, to extract barrels of oil from the ground. And they did that at Alberta's invitation and more particularly the invitation of employers within Alberta. That's not a bad thing. That's actually how we say we want it to work. Conservatives who promote agreements on internal labor mobility, that's all so that people can work in one province and retire in another, or work in different provinces at different times. They're not just fans of international labor mobility within Canada. They've been fans of international labor mobility internationally. You wouldn't know it to listen to them talking in the House of Commons today, but the trade agreements that they've supported consistently over the last 30 years have all included labor mobility chapters in order to make it easier for companies to take workers from outside of Canada and bring them here. Now they say they're offended that there's going to be some South Korean workers coming to set up battery plants. I share their concern. I don't think that public investment was made in order to create jobs for people outside of Canada. I do think the government should have gotten some guarantees on that. But I also recognize that Canada currently, and I'm glad that it will in the future, currently doesn't have expertise in battery manufacturing. What the Conservatives say when they defend international labor mobility clauses in trade agreements is that sometimes you need expertise that doesn't exist, and we shouldn't make it hard on businesses to secure the expertise they need to set up shop in Canada and have successful investments. But now all of a sudden, when that's happening, under the very clauses that they bragged they negotiated, it's a crime. It's a crime, and we're all supposed to be really upset about it. I think they need to get their house in order and decide what they're in favor of or not. I say this with some great comfort because as a New Democrat, we've often been very critical of the labor mobility chapters in trade agreements. I think of the CPTPP and the Canada-Europe trade agreements, CETA. If you go back and look at the record, what were we talking about? Among other things, the international labor mobility provisions and how they're sometimes abused in order to import workers to keep wages in Canada artificially low. So yeah, I'm quite familiar with this debate. What they're doing in terms of calling those workers replacement workers so that they can get out of taking a position on anti-scab legislation, I think is sad and pathetic, and I think does a disservice to debate in the House of Commons and a disservice to Canadian workers who have their job taken while they're out on the picket line. But let's not pretend like somehow this is a new concern or that we don't know about how this works or where these workers are coming from or how they're getting into the country. We know they're coming because they're coming under the auspices of the very agreements the Conservatives like to brag they negotiated. So give me a break on that one. All that to say, Conservatives support labor mobility, but when it doesn't suit them, they're happy to turn around and complain about it. They're complaining about it right now in the context of these battery plants. I think there are some important concerns there that have to be addressed, but we're not going to get to the bottom of it if we're not honest about the mechanisms by which they're coming And now the Alberta government wants to say that even though they've supported labor mobility for workers to come to Alberta and to work in Alberta, when they decide to take their retirement back home close to their family, that somehow there's some kind of financial inequity. That's not true if you look at it and realize that that money belongs to the worker and they should be free to take their retirement income wherever they want. Government should not dictate where people are allowed to take their retirement. If we believe in full mobility within Canada as a right of Canadian citizenship and the right of a Canadian worker, and that therefore should not be used as an argument for fiscal iniquity when we're talking about the Canada Pension Plan. So, you know, is this motion divisive? No, I think it's reasonable to criticize the Danielle Smith government for all the reasons that I've just laid out. And we need to be able to have a frank conversation about the one reliable pillar of Canadians' retirement income. And it's okay to name names in that debate. Danielle Smith doesn't hesitate to mention names of people she disagrees with. The Conservatives don't hesitate to mention the names of the people they disagree with. I've certainly heard Conservatives criticize Rachel Notley if we want to talk about federal politicians criticizing provincial politicians. They certainly didn't hesitate from criticizing the Notley government. So the idea that somehow it's automatically divisive or out of bounds for people to criticize folks in provincial politics, it's an argument I might accept from my Bloc colleague, but I'm not going to accept it from the Conservatives, who have made a trade of attacking provincial governments that they disagree with. And so I was interested in this question, and I went back and thought it was quite interesting to see that Pierre Poilievre, the now leader of the Conservative Party, in 2018 said, Madam, I believe it was at this very committee, said, Madam Chair, the Finance Minister is now commenting on the provincial policies in the various jurisdictions. That is just fine. In Ontario, and then he went on to attack the Wynne government. So we've heard directly from the Conservative leader that he thinks it's totally fair game, and we've heard him not only for him saying that it was fine, for Bill Morneau at the time, who incidentally went on to write that, well, he's the owner of the company that wrote the report for the Alberta government, but never mind. He's done it himself. He's done it many times. On October 30th of this year, my colleague Jenny Kwan got up to ask him a question about social and co-op housing in the House of Commons. He got up and said, oh, look at what the BC NDP is doing. Social housing is a Soviet-style takeover of housing. Well, you can think what you want about the comment. I think it's patently absurd myself. That's just totally ridiculous. But he made it. He made it. And that was a criticism of a provincial government. And now, oh, well, we can't name a provincial government. That would be really divisive. Well, to call the BC government a Soviet government isn't language that I would characterize as designed to encourage national unity, Mr. Chair. So let's just take a pause on that and reflect on that. Let's also reflect on the fact that the Conservative leader has hardly any meaningful policies to address the housing crisis. The one thing he hangs his hat on is going after municipal politicians outside federal jurisdiction, right? Like municipal jurisdiction is not federal jurisdiction. And he's been making a career of going around the country attacking municipal jurisdiction and attacking municipal politicians. Not a great move from a national unity point of view. Not a move that says we can't talk about what other levels of government are doing here. Clearly not. That's kind of his whole thing on housing, is talking about other levels of government. So he doesn't have to talk about the absence of federal housing policy in his own bill, which is really about giving land away to developers in a similar fashion that we saw take place in Ontario. So now we've got an amendment to this motion because the Conservatives, more than anything, want to take out reference to Danielle Smith because they're taking their cues from Preston Manning. And the amendment is to take out reference of Alberta's plan to leave and replace it with a bunch of stuff about energy policy so that they've got something they'd prefer to talk about. Well, that's consistent with a strategy we've seen now for a while, which is that the Conservatives don't want to talk about any of the things that are politically inconvenient for them. So we saw that right when we came back to the House. Thank you, Phil. Right when we came back to the House, the Prime Minister made some serious allegations. We've seen now that the U.S. is similarly concerned about an assassination attempt by a sick nationalist on its own soil. We saw the Prime Minister make what was a very serious accusation at that time, and we had a debate about it for an entire evening in the House of Commons. And in the course of that debate, we saw one Conservative speaker speak for 5 minutes, and they took a pass on the rest of the debate because we know Stephen Harper.
Point of order. What? I'm sorry, Chair, but what's the relevance in this to the motion?
I would ask the MP Blakey be relevant to the motion and the amendment, and I'd also ask MP Tokar if I know there's been a lot of chatter, and if you could just keep it down while MP Blakey is making his comments. MP Blakey?
Yeah, I'm happy to establish the relevance. My argument is that this amendment is designed to give them an excuse to talk about something else other than what is uncomfortable for them to talk about, which is the Canada Pension Plan generally and Danielle Smith specifically. And I'm establishing that it's part of a pattern of behavior that we've seen from the Conservatives.
Chair, this has nothing to do with the motion on the floor. It's not relevant.
It is on. It is.
It has nothing to do with the amendment.
It is on the amendment. Yes, it is. So continue, MP Blakey.
I do not think
Yeah.
Danielle Smith's an amendment.
MP Tokar, I've ruled. MP Blakey, please.
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order.
The sub-amendment that we're supposed to be talking about is very clear, and I would challenge what you're saying. It says, this Liberal government's policies, such as the carbon tax and C-69, are leading to greater division in our country. I don't see Danielle Smith's name in there. I don't see the pension plan in there. I don't see anything like that
Thank
in
you,
there.
MP
and
Howland.
on
Well,
that.
we're speaking
We are
to the
on
motion and the amendment.
We are
So,
speaking
yeah,
to the
so,
sub-amendment.
Two things.
Yeah. So we're speaking
Well,
to both.
no, there is no sub-amendment right now,
MP
Jazz.
Blakey,
There's just your
you
own
have the
amendment.
floor.
And the part you didn't read is that it removes Clause 3 from the original motion, which is the clause that makes reference to Danielle Smith. So give me a break, guys. This is not unlike what we witnessed in the House last night, where we saw two Conservative members get up to speak to anti-scab legislation and never once spoke to the bill, never once mentioned the term strike, never once mentioned the term lockout, never once talked about replacement workers in any relevant sense. This is my point, is that when it's politically uncomfortable for them to talk about something, they don't. And they make up other things to talk about, or they insert other things.
Crosstalk, allow the member that has the floor to continue. Yeah.
They insert other things into the debate. And it's not an accident that they started interrupting me when I started talking about India, because part of their silence was designed to protect Modi, someone that Stephen Harper has a very close personal relationship with and has even tweeted about since positively. And so the Conservatives took a pass on that debate because Stephen Harper has a close relationship with Modi in India, and they want to look past some of the serious human rights violations that the government of India is responsible for, and they don't want to talk about it. So then when I start talking about it, you start getting disruptive points of order because it's uncomfortable for them. And their strategy is to silence people, just as they've been trying to silence this committee because they don't like the fact that some of us don't agree with Danielle Smith and are willing to name it. So they haven't allowed us to have a vote. That's really what all this is about. It's about avoiding a vote because they know that a number of us on this committee are critical of Danielle Smith, and they don't accept that anyone could be. And they are the ones who like to talk a lot about democracy and the importance of democracy, but you see in their behavior that when you don't agree with their position, they seek to silence you. They seek to stop decisions being made when they know they're not going to get the outcome that they want. That is the most undemocratic that you can be. And so
Point of
they
order,
did
Chair.
it.
Thanks. Just a point of order that the member from the NDP has been speaking now for 30 minutes. I thought he would find that incredibly
Not a
relevant
point
to
of
the
order.
part of the
Order.
conversation.
MP Blakey, please. Continue.
I'm sorry, I was just trying to have equal time with Mr. Couric. I didn't realize that would be objectionable to him. And in fact, I think in order, and I think to meet the bar, I still have some ways to go. So I will continue.
About an hour and 20.
And So I think I made the point on India, which was that what we saw was a strategic silence by the Conservatives when Parliament talking about an issue they didn't like wasn't in their political interest. And so that's how they got out of that one. We're seeing something similar happen on the Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement. They decided that they wanted to vote against it. I talked earlier about Preston Manning encouraging closer collaboration between Danielle Smith and federal Conservatives. What we're seeing in the United States and the Republican movement there, and Donald Trump particularly, who I think was bought and paid for by Russia, Republicans are raising doubts and criticisms of Ukraine in order to undermine that effort. And we know that a lot of strategy is shared between Canadian Conservatives and the Republican Party in the United States. And they're going to these conventions now with Republicans in the States. And what are they hearing? That we should be more critical of Ukraine. And so what are they doing? For maybe the first time ever, voting against an international free trade agreement. They want to make it about the carbon tax because that's what they like to talk about. Suddenly, they're not talking about the war in Ukraine anymore. They're talking about the carbon tax. They're not talking about the fact that President Zelensky himself wanted Canada to implement this agreement and asked Canada to vote in favor of it. They're not talking about the fact that on Dignity and Freedom Day in the Ukraine, they voted against the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement that President Zelensky had asked Canada to pass because they want to talk about the carbon tax because that's more politically expedient for them. So to try and make the Canada-Ukraine conflict about the carbon tax works better for them than explaining why, after hanging out with their Republican buddies in the United States, they came back and decided to vote against the Canada Free Trade Agreement. I get why that's an uncomfortable conversation, but that's the conversation we should be having, not another conversation about the carbon tax, which we have often in this place, and which is often used to distract from a number of topics. And in fact, I've seen Conservative MPs use that strategy who are from provinces that don't even have the federal carbon tax apply. In British Columbia, there's no federal carbon tax, and yet I've watched Conservative MP after Conservative MP get up to talk about how they're serving their constituents by talking about the federal carbon tax as if the carbon tax in BC wouldn't apply the day after a federal carbon tax was eliminated. And so we see pretty consistent strategies going on. I made reference earlier, and I'll do it again, and I'm sorry Mr. Perkins isn't here because he was one of the MPs who were up in the chamber last night about the anti-scab legislation, an uncomfortable topic for Conservatives to talk about because they have been trying to portray themselves as being on the side of workers. We know that the right to strike is one of the most important rights when it comes to workers being able to stand up for themselves and bring home powerful paychecks. And we know, because we've watched Conservatives vote against anti-scab legislation in the past, we've watched them vote for right-to-work legislation in the past, that they're not on the side of workers. They don't want to talk about it in the House. It's why they wouldn't talk about it in the House last night.
This time, so there is, we were talking about Ukraine, and the Holodomor commemoration is happening at this time on the Hill. So members, we will be suspended.